It was past midnight when the storm broke. Thunder rolled like distant drums, and the glass walls of the 42nd floor rattled under the wind's howl. Inside the darkened executive office, only one faint glow remained, the red standby light of the security camera, quietly watching everything. The company logo, once a symbol of dominance in its industry, now seemed almost mocking in the faint light, hanging crooked above the mahogany desk. The smell of stale coffee lingered. A half-empty cup, long gone cold, sat beside a stack of financial reports marked with furious red ink. Across the room, the whiteboard stood like a battlefield scarred with numbers, arrows, and underlined phrases. Loss projection Q4, layoffs, investor pullout, and in the center, a single word circled 3 times in heavy black marker. Impossible. Earlier that evening, the CEO, Alexander Cole, had stood before that board with his hands in his hair, staring at the brutal truth. His empire was crumbling. Deals were collapsing, shares were plummeting, and the bank had given him just 3 weeks to produce a viable recovery plan. 3 weeks, or everything he had built over 2 decades would be torn apart. And then, exhausted and furious, he'd left. Hours later, the elevator's soft chime broke the silence. The doors opened, and a figure stepped out, wearing worn gray coveralls, a mop handle resting against one shoulder, and a plastic bucket rolling softly across the carpet. Luis Alvarez had been cleaning this building for almost 7 years. Invisible to most, he moved like a shadow between empty conference rooms and abandoned workstations. He never touched anything he wasn't meant to, never lingered where he wasn't welcome. But that night, something pulled him toward the whiteboard. The markers lay scattered at its base. He hesitated, glancing toward the camera in the corner, but the storm's rumble seemed to push him forward. His eyes scanned the chaotic mess of figures and notes. The language of finance was foreign to most, but Luce's mind was sharper than anyone would guess. Back in his home country, before everything fell apart, he had studied engineering and logistics. Numbers still spoke to him. Slowly, he traced the arrows and figures with his eyes. The patterns of loss, the weak points. And then, like a sudden flash of lightning, he saw it, the gap no one else had noticed. An overlooked division that could be pivoted, merged, and leveraged into an entirely new revenue stream. Lees looked around. The office was still. The rain lashed harder against the windows. He picked up a black marker. Within minutes, the whiteboard was transformed. The messy storm of ideas now flowed into a clean, precise solution. A sequence of steps. A cost-cutting maneuver that wouldn't require mass layoffs. A reinvestment strategy using assets already owned. And at the very bottom, in small, neat handwriting, time is not the enemy. Misplaced focus is. He capped the marker, stepped back, and just stared for a moment. A flicker of pride crossed his tired face. Then he returned the marker to the floor, picked up his mop, and quietly left the office as if nothing had happened. The camera in the corner had caught everything. The next morning, Alexander Cole arrived at the building before sunrise, his usual armor of confidence cracked by another sleepless night. His assistant trailed behind him, rattling off updates. More bad news, more calls from panicked investors. Alexander barely heard her. He stepped into his office and stopped cold. The whiteboard was different. No more chaos. No more tangled arrows. Instead, a clean, logical plan stood before him, written in unfamiliar handwriting. At first, he assumed one of his senior strategists had stayed late. But the phrasing, the structure, it wasn't corporate jargon. It was direct, clear, almost surgical. And it was brilliant. Alexander's pulse quickened as he read through the steps. The possibility of survival, no, of victory, rose in his chest. He turned to his assistant, his voice suddenly sharp. "Who was in here last night?" She blinked. No one, sir." You left around 9. Security said the floor was empty. Alexander narrowed his eyes and walked to his desk. Get security. Pull the footage from every camera on this floor. I want to know who touched this board. But why? She asked carefully. Because, Alexander said, still staring at the neat black handwriting, someone just saved my company, and I have no idea who they are. The footage didn't take long to find. The grainy recording showed Luis entering the office, stopping in front of the whiteboard, thinking, writing. The camera caught the moment his eyes lit up with an idea. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just a man quietly solving what the brightest minds in the building had failed to fix. Alexander leaned back in his chair, watching it again and again. Who is this? He asked. Luis Alvarez, security replied. Night shift janitor. Works through a cleaning contractor. Been here for years. A janitor. Alexander sat in silence for a long moment, the word echoing in his head. Then a slow, almost dangerous smile crept across his face. Call him, he said. I want him in my office tonight. That evening, the storm had passed, but the air still felt electric. Luis entered the CEO's office with cautious steps, hat in hand, unsure why he'd been summoned. Alexander stood by the window, the city's skyline burning orange in the sunset. Do you know why you're here? Alexander asked, turning slowly. Luis shook his head. No, sir. Alexander gestured toward the whiteboard. That, you did that. Luis's eyes flicked to the board, then back to the CEO. I was just cleaning. I saw the numbers. Thought maybe there was another way. Another way? Alexander's tone sharpened. You rewrote the future of this company. That's not another way. That's genius. Luis shifted uncomfortably. I didn't mean to overstep. Overstep? Alexander stepped closer. You might have just saved thousands of jobs, including mine. Luis said nothing. Alexander's gaze was intense, calculating. Tell me, Mr. Alvarez, where did you learn to think like this? Luis hesitated. Back home, I studied engineering, but life happened. Alexander nodded slowly. Life always happens. But solutions like that, he pointed to the board, they don't happen without a mind built for strategy. Luis lowered his eyes. I just wanted to help. Alexander studied him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, help me finish this plan. I'll make it worth your while. Luis didn't answer right away. The offer hung in the air, tempting and dangerous all at once. His instinct told him to step back, to retreat into the safety of invisibility. People like him weren't invited into boardrooms. They were paid to keep them clean. I'm not sure that's a good idea, sir, Luis finally said. This isn't my world. Alexander's mouth twitched into something between a smirk and a challenge. It's exactly your world now. You've already stepped into it, and there's no one seeing what you've seen. Luis frowned. What do you mean? I mean, Alexander said, walking toward his desk, that this company is days away from drowning. Your idea might be the only life raft we have. And if you think I'm going to just erase your name from that equation, you're wrong. You're in this now. Luis shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I clean floors. I don't. You solve problems, Alexander interrupted, his voice low and firm. That's what I need. The CEO picked up a sleek folder from his desk and slid it across the polished wood. Sit, Luis sat. The leather chair swallowed him whole. He opened the folder and found printed copies of the plan he'd written on the board, but now expanded. Bullet points, projections, cost analyses. Alexander had been working on it all day. I want you to walk me through it, Alexander said, line by line. Tell me if I missed anything. Luis hesitated, then began. His voice was steady as he explained each move. how certain underperforming assets could be merged into a single division to cut overhead, how a dormant patent could be sold to free capital without harming future operations, how shifting a key supplier could save millions annually. Alexander listened without interrupting, his sharp eyes studying not just the words, but the man delivering them. There was no arrogance in Luce's tone, only clarity and precision. When Luis finished, Alexander leaned back. "You've just confirmed something I suspected all day." "What's that?" "That you don't belong on a cleaning crew. You belong in a war room." Luis shook his head. "I'm not looking for a new job, Mr. Cole." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "Then why did you pick up that marker last night?" Luis hesitated. He didn't have an easy answer. "Because I hate waste." I saw the answer sitting right there, and no one was using it. A slow smile spread across Alexander's face. "Hate waste. I like that." He stood. "You're coming with me tomorrow. There's a meeting with the board. I want you in the room." Luce's heart jolted. "The board?" You're not going to say no," Alexander cut in. "Be here at 7 a.m. Wear something other than those coveralls. And don't tell anyone about this." "Not yet." The next morning, Luis stood in front of the building's glass facade, wearing the only suit he owned, a faded charcoal number he'd bought years ago for a cousin's wedding. He felt out of place, like an imposter sneaking into a castle. Inside, Alexander met him in the lobby, already dressed in an immaculate navy suit. He gave Luis a once-over and nodded approvingly. "Good enough. Let's go." The elevator ride to the top floor was silent. The air grew colder the higher they went, the hum of machinery replaced by a suffocating stillness. When the doors opened, they stepped into a long conference room lined with panoramic windows. Around the massive glass table sat the board members, a collection of polished, severe faces, each more skeptical than the last. Alexander wasted no time. He strode to the head of the table and began outlining the crisis. Charts flashed on the massive screen behind him, each one showing the company's decline in brutal detail. Then, without warning, he gestured toward Luis. "This," Alexander said, "is the man who found our way out." A ripple of murmurs swept the room. Several eyebrows lifted, a few lips curled in disdain. Luis swallowed hard, but stepped forward. He began explaining the plan, the same steps he'd outlined to Alexander the night before, but now with every eye fixed on him. The weight of the board's skepticism pressed against his chest, but he kept his voice steady. One member interrupted. "Where did you say you work?" Luis hesitated. "Night cleaning shift." The room went still. Then a few smirks appeared. One man leaned back in his chair with a condescending smile. "So we're taking financial advice from the janitor now." Alexander's gaze snapped to him, sharp as a blade. "We're taking advice from the only person in this building who solved the problem. Unless you've got a better idea?" The man's smirk faded. The room stayed silent. Luis continued, this time with more force. By the time he finished, there was no smirking, only calculating expressions. Finally, the chairwoman spoke. "If this works, it could stabilize us within the quarter." "It will work," Alexander said firmly. "And I'm putting him in charge of overseeing the implementation." Luis blinked. "I what?" The chairwoman frowned. "That's highly irregular." "So is losing $200 million in projected revenue," Alexander shot back. "We need results, not tradition." After a long pause, the chairwoman nodded slowly. "Fine. But if this fails—" "It won't," Alexander said, cutting her off. When the meeting ended, Luis followed Alexander out into the hallway, his mind spinning. "I don't understand," Luis said. "Why are you doing this?" Alexander stopped and turned to face him. "Because I've seen 100 men in $1,000 suits who can't think their way out of a paper bag. You? You see the whole board, not just the next move. That's rare." Luis looked away. "I just Don't want to regret getting involved." Alexander's voice softened, but only slightly. "Regret comes from inaction, Louise. You acted. That's why we're still breathing." As they walked toward the elevator, neither of them noticed the man standing at the far end of the hall, half hidden behind a column. His eyes tracked Louise with something colder than curiosity. That night, long after the office had emptied, Luis returned to his janitorial duties. He moved through the silent corridors with his mop and bucket, pretending that the events of the day hadn't happened. But as he passed Alexander's office, he noticed something strange. The whiteboard was clean, completely wiped. A small note was taped to its center. "We're not the only ones watching." Luis froze. Luis stood in the doorway of Alexander's office, staring at the empty whiteboard. His eyes went to the security camera in the corner, its tiny red light still blinking. Whoever left that note hadn't been afraid of being seen. He stepped closer, peeled the note from the board, and read the handwriting again. Sharp, deliberate strokes, not rushed. This was someone confident enough to leave a message and walk away. The elevator dinged behind him. Luis turned, and Alexander strode in, still in his suit despite the late hour. He froze when he saw Luis. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same," Luis said, holding out the note. "Found this taped to your board." Alexander took it, his eyes scanning the words. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, quickly masked. "Get out of here," he said quietly. Luis frowned. "You know who wrote it?" Alexander didn't answer. He walked to his desk, tossed the note into a drawer, and shut it firmly. "It's nothing you need to worry about." "That's not nothing," Luis said, his voice sharper now. "That's a warning." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Warnings are part of this business." Luis stared at him. "And what business am I in now, exactly?" Alexander met his gaze. "The one where you help me fix this company and ignore the ghosts in the hall." Something in his tone told Luis not to push further, at least not tonight. He picked up his bucket and left without another word. The following morning, Alexander called Luis into his office. Spread across the desk were stacks of documents, some stamped "Confidential" in red. "We start today," Alexander said. "I'll walk you through the departments. You'll see where your plan fits and where we'll need to adapt." Luis leaned over the desk, scanning the papers. He noticed a section of budget allocations that didn't match the numbers he'd seen yesterday. "This line here," Luis said, pointing, "it's off. These expenses don't belong to R&D." Alexander didn't look surprised. They've been hiding losses in there for years. It's how they keep investors calm. Luis looked up. "You knew?" "I know everything in this company," Alexander said flatly. "But knowing and proving are two different things. You focus on fixing. I'll focus on protecting us while you do it." The day unfolded in a blur. Alexander walked Luis through each department, introducing him as a special consultant. Luis noticed the way people's eyes slid over him, assessing, doubting. In the marketing division, a young executive named Claire leaned toward Luis after Alexander stepped away. "You're the janitor, right?" she asked in a whisper. Luis didn't flinch. "Was," she smirked. "Good luck. You're going to need it." By the end of the day, Luis's head was full of names, problems, and undercurrents of tension. The company wasn't just in financial crisis. It was rotting from the inside. Departments fought over resources. Mid-level managers protected their turf like medieval lords, and no one trusted anyone else. That night, as Luis prepared to leave, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Don't trust him. A friend Luis stared at the screen. He almost deleted the message, but something in the simplicity of it unsettled him. 2 days later, the first phase of Luis's plan was underway. Supplier contracts were being renegotiated, unnecessary software licenses canceled, and a dormant product line revived for a targeted niche market. The changes were subtle but effective, and that made someone nervous. Late one evening, as Luis left the building, he noticed his car. An old Honda he'd parked 2 blocks away had its rear window shattered. Nothing was stolen. He drove home with the cold wind cutting through the glass, his thoughts circling the same question. Who had that much to lose if the company was saved? Meanwhile, Alexander was fighting his own battle. In a private meeting with 2 board members, he was confronted about bringing an unvetted outsider into high-level operations. "This man isn't vetted at all," one of them said. "He could be a liability." Alexander leaned forward. "He's the reason we're still on the boardroom floor and not in bankruptcy court. If that's a liability, I'll take it." They didn't push further, but their silence was heavy. The following week brought the first measurable success. Luce's cost-cutting measures saved the company nearly $3 million in under 7 days. Morale shifted slightly. Whispers of "maybe we'll make it" began to replace the quiet despair in the halls. That's when Luis received the second message: "You're fixing the wrong problem." A friend Luis replied this time, "What's the right one?" The answer came 10 minutes later: "Follow the money outside the building." The phrase gnawed at him for days. On Thursday evening, after everyone had left, Luis accessed the finance department's digital records. Alexander had given him clearance, so there was no hacking involved, but what he found was enough to quicken his pulse. Millions were flowing through the company each quarter, not just to suppliers and operational costs, but to an unlisted consulting firm based in an offshore tax haven. And that firm? It shared an address with a private holding company, one that on paper had nothing to do with Alexander Coal Industries. Luis printed the records and slipped them into a folder. The next morning, he placed the folder on Alexander's desk. Alexander glanced at it, then at Luis. "What's this?" "Proof," Luis said. "Someone's bleeding this company on purpose." Alexander opened the folder. His expression didn't change, but his grip on the papers tightened. "I told you not to chase ghosts," he said quietly. "These aren't ghosts," Luis replied. "These are thieves." Alexander closed the folder and set it aside. "Leave it with me?" Luis frowned. "That's it? You're not going to—" "I said leave it with me," Alexander repeated, his tone final. Luis walked out, but the unease in his chest told him one thing. Whatever was happening, Alexander was already in the middle of it. That night, Luz's phone buzzed again. "You're closer than you think. Meet me." 11:30 p.m. corner of 8th and Grand. Alone. A friend Luis stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the reply. The streets around 8th and Grand were nearly deserted at that hour, lit only by the flicker of an old neon sign from a boarded-up diner. The rain had returned, drizzling in thin, cold lines that streaked the asphalt and painted the city in silver. Luis stood on the corner, his hood up, his hands deep in his pockets. Every shadow looked like it might move. At 11:33 p.m., a dark sedan pulled up to the curb. The rear window slid down halfway, revealing a woman in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and a voice like she'd been holding secrets for years. "Get in," she said. Luis hesitated. "Who are you?" "Someone who doesn't have time for you to decide," she replied. "You want answers or not?" Against his better judgment, Luis climbed in. The car smelled faintly of leather and cigarette smoke. "I've been sending the messages," she said as the car pulled away. "Call me Aaron." Luis studied her profile. "Why me?" "Because you're the only one who doesn't owe them anything," she said. "The only one who doesn't already have blood on his hands." "Them meaning?" Aaron glanced at him. "The people who've been using this company as their personal bank account for the last decade. The offshore transfers you found? That's just the surface." Luis leaned forward. "Alexander knows." Her lips curled into something between a smirk and a grimace. Of course he knows. He's not the one stealing the money, but he's been letting it happen. It's the price of keeping his position. Luis felt the words like a punch to the gut. Then why is he letting me fix the company? Because you're not fixing the real leak, Aaron said. You're patching the roof while the foundation rots. And sooner or later, they're going to make sure you stop asking questions. The car turned down a narrow side street. Erin reached into her coat and pulled out a small flash drive. Everything you need is on here. Names, dates, accounts. But if you take it, you can't unknow it. And you can't trust anyone inside that building. Not even him. Luis stared at the drive. It felt heavier than it should. Why are you giving this to me? Because I can't use it. My name's already poisoned. Yours isn't, yet. She slowed the car and stopped at a corner. Get out. And remember, if they know you have it, you won't make it through the week. Luis stepped out into the rain. By the time he turned back, the sedan was already disappearing into the night. The next morning, Luis sat in his small apartment, the flash drive in his hand. He plugged it into his old laptop, half expecting it to explode. Instead, a single folder appeared. Archive. Inside were hundreds of files, spreadsheets, scanned contracts, internal memos. Every document told the same story. A network of shell companies siphoning millions out of Alexander Coal Industries and into private accounts connected to board members, executives, and political figures. Luis felt his pulse pounding. This wasn't just corruption. It was organized. Theft on a scale that could sink half the company's leadership if it came to light. And Alexander's name appeared more than once. Not as a thief, but as a signatory, approving transactions that kept the machine running. At noon, Luis walked into Alexander's office. He didn't sit. I know, he said. Alexander looked up from his desk. Know what? Luis set the flash drive down in front of him. Everything. Alexander's gaze didn't flicker. He picked up the drive, turning it in his fingers like it was nothing more than a paperclip. You've been busy, Alexander said finally. Luis's voice was steady. You could have stopped it. I could have lost everything, Alexander corrected, including the only chance to save what matters. Saving what matters doesn't mean protecting thieves, Luis said. Alexander leaned back in his chair. You think you can walk into my office with a drive full of poison and demand I burn down the entire board? Do that, and the company collapses. Thousands of people lose their jobs. You fix nothing. Luis clenched his fists. So you keep playing their game? Alexander's eyes hardened. No, I play mine. And you're in it now, whether you like it or not. That night, Luis couldn't sleep. Aaron's warning echoed in his head. He knew Alexander was right about one thing. A public scandal could destroy the company completely. But doing nothing meant letting the rot continue. He needed a third option. 2 days later, Alexander summoned Luis to a private dinner in a quiet, upscale restaurant. The room was empty except for the two of them and a single waiter. I have a proposal, Alexander said, pouring himself a glass of wine. We keep fixing the company, publicly. Quietly, we strip their power, one asset at a time. We bury them under their own mistakes, make them irrelevant before they even realize they've lost. Luis considered it. And the evidence? Alexander's smile was thin. It disappears. Luis shook his head. No, I'm keeping it. Alexander's gaze cooled. That's not a negotiation. It's not meant to be, Luis said. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Alexander raised his glass in a slow, deliberate toast. You'd better hope you're smarter than they are. Later that night, as Luis walked home, he noticed headlights in his peripheral vision. A black SUV was pacing him from the opposite side of the street. He turned a corner. The SUV followed. Luis's instincts screamed. He ducked into an alley. weaving between dumpsters and fire escapes. Behind him, a car door slammed. Heavy footsteps splashed through puddles. He ran. A hand caught his shoulder, yanking him back. A figure in a hood stepped into his path. The metallic glint of a weapon flashed under the streetlight. "You should have stayed invisible," a voice growled. Lee swung the mop handle he still carried from work, not as a weapon, but as a shield. The impact cracked against the man's wrist, sending the weapon clattering to the ground. Luis didn't wait. He ran until his lungs burned, the sound of shouting fading into the rain. When he finally reached the safety of his apartment, he locked the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. On his table, the flash drive sat exactly where he'd left it, silent, small, and now the most dangerous thing he owned. 3 days passed without incident, though Luis could feel the pressure building. People at the company had started watching him differently. Some stopped conversations when he entered the room. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The paranoia wasn't unfounded. On the 4th day, Luis returned to his apartment to find the door ajar. Inside, nothing was stolen, but the flash drive was gone. His stomach dropped. He called Erin. No answer. He tried again. The line went straight to voicemail. An hour later, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You're out of time. Rooftop, 9 p.m. alone." Luis stared at it. The rooftop of what? Before he could reply, another text came, the one where it started. He knew immediately. The roof of Alexander Coal Industries, where the CEO's private helipad sat. At 9 p.m., Luis climbed the final steel ladder to the rooftop. The wind was brutal, carrying the city's distant sirens and the hum of traffic below. Alexander was already there, standing near the edge, his coat whipping in the wind. The flash drive dangled from his hand. "You've made this more complicated than it had to be," Alexander said, his voice calm despite the gale. "You stole it from me." "I retrieved it," Alexander corrected. "You were holding something you didn't fully understand. If this gets out in the wrong way, it doesn't just hurt them. It burns everything to the ground, including you." Luis stepped forward. "And what's your way, Alexander? Sit on it until the thieves retire? Keep letting them run the show?" Alexander's eyes locked on his. "My way ends them without ending us. But you don't trust me enough to let me do it." "Because trust isn't what built this company," Luis said. "People like me, invisible people, did." Alexander's mouth curved into a faint, unreadable smile. "You're not invisible anymore, Luis. That's the problem." Before Luis could respond, a voice cut through the wind. "Drop it, Alexander." Luis turned. Erin was there, emerging from the rooftop access door, a pistol steady in her hand. "I told you not to trust him," she said to Luis, keeping her aim on Alexander. "He's not going to fix anything. He's going to bury it, just like they told him to." Alexander didn't move. "You're still playing the wrong game, Erin. You've been out of it too long to see the board clearly." She took a step closer. "And you've been in it too long to see anything else." Luis felt the weight of the moment, pressing in from both sides. He could almost hear the choice forming in his head. Take the flash drive from Alexander and side with Erin, or give it back to the CEO and trust his long game. Except there was a third option. In one sudden motion, Luis closed the gap between them, snatched the flash drive from Alexander's hand, and spun toward the edge of the roof. "What are you doing?" Erin shouted. Luis looked at both of them, making sure neither of you gets to decide. And then he hurled the flash drive into the night. It spun once in the air before vanishing into the darkness below. Erin's face went pale. Alexander just stared at him, his expression unreadable. "You think that solves anything?" Erin demanded. "No," Luis said. "But it means I'm the only one who knows exactly where I've already backed up every file. And neither of you knows if I've shared it yet." Alexander's smile returned, this time sharper. So you've made yourself the most valuable and the most dangerous person in the city. Luis shrugged. Guess I'm not invisible anymore. The next morning, Luis returned to work as if nothing had happened. The boardroom was abuzz with talk of new strategic initiatives and upcoming restructures. Alexander passed him in the hall, offering only a brief glance. No smile, no words. Just the faintest nod, the kind given to an opponent worthy of the game. As weeks turned into months, Luis saw the changes begin. Quiet resignations. Sudden, health-related retirements. Shell companies collapsing without explanation. The rot was being cut away, piece by piece. But every so often, Luis would catch Alexander watching him from across the office. The look of a man who respected the move, but never forgot the threat. One rainy evening, nearly a year later, Luis received an unmarked envelope under his door. Inside was a single piece of paper. There's a new board forming. A seat is waiting for you. No signature. No sender. But he knew the handwriting. Luis smiled faintly, folded the note, and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't know whether Alexander was inviting him into the game or into the trap, but it didn't matter. Either way, he was ready. Because somewhere, hidden far from the city, in a place only he knew, a certain flash drive still waited. And with it, every secret that could burn the empire to the ground. And if the day came that he needed to use it, well, that would be his move.